Alright, we're going to talk about mixing consoles. The first thing we're going to talk about is that when you're working on a hardware console or working in the DAW, the concepts are basically the same. There's different things you can do, and you have a lot more freedom in the DAW than you do with just a standard mixing console, even an elaborate one, that you've got a lot more options in a DAW. So just keep that in mind that I don't use a hardware console at this point. Because I don't really have a need for one the way that I would mix and record, unless it's some kind of a live function that I actually need one for something that I normally don't, because, you've just got a lot more freedom inside the DAW. Now, one thing is that, I want to address real quick is the first thing is that, when you first look at mixing consoles, there are tons of them. I mean, there are thousands of them. There's big ones, small ones, complicated looking ones, real simple looking ones. I mean, there are so many different types of mixing consoles, it's not even funny. Now, with all these consoles, obviously that, if they were all just mixing consoles, there'd be like 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 of them, right? That maybe did a couple of different things. Or they would have integrated what a console should be able to do into one. So you'd have one mixing console. Well, you don't, just like with microphones, so you've got thousands of them. So you basically need to figure out what you need. And the problem is a lot of people look at a mixing console and they'll look at a fairly simple one and they go, okay, well, that's not too bad. I figured that out. And they look at this some big old SSL or something, and they're like, well, geez, I'll never be able to figure that out. That thing is huge, what is all those buttons and all those knobs? And it goes on for a mile and a half. Well, basically the basic concept isn't any different. So that, we're going to go through this one step at a time so that, you can take a mixing console and look at it and break it down into its separate components. Because basically, what's happening is they're separate components. And even when you look at it, a whole lot of times, that it's set up to where you can actually see that it's separate components, separate areas that are going to do different things. And so you kind of want to look at it that way. That way that as you're going through it and trying to understand it, that, each one of those areas and each one of their functions are a separate, area and a separate function and, that are working together. Now, the problem is that, we want to take every one of those simple concepts and understand them so we can understand the larger complexities so that when we're looking at a smaller mixing console or a big SSL or something like that, we walk into a big studio, that we should be able to understand all these concepts and all the things happening here well enough to where we might have to ask a question or two, or if nobody was around, we might have to pull out, an owner's manual and say, well, I don't understand how they've stated it, because they've used some other kind of lettering system, or they've worded it differently, or the configuration is differently, or the layout of the console is different. And it might take you an hour or so to fidget around with it and look around with it and play with some knobs and look at things to get it all worked out exactly how that console works. But you should have, hopefully by the end of this series, that you've got enough understanding of all the basic concepts that go into making that larger complexity so that you can break it down into its smaller elements and address them one at a time through the console, whichever console you're working on, to understand what that console is doing. Another issue can be routing, some signal flow inside the console. That's another thing you want to look at, and sometimes that's not real obvious by looking at the console itself. The layout may look real obvious, but I've ran into a few where it just wasn't, and so you want to get out a wiring diagram sometimes and see what's going on there so you can understand the signal flow a little bit better. So that's how we're going to approach it, and we're going to go through and we're basically going to go in and we're going to go start in Wikipedia. I recommend them. They're a great resource, and send them $3 if you get a chance. They could use $3. If everybody pitched in $3, you got a free library there. That is so cool. Well, almost free. You know what I'm saying? And so, and it's a great resource. So what we're going to do is we're going to start right here in Wikipedia on Mixing Console. And we're going to go through it one step at a time and read through it. And then we're going to go address issues that might not be real self-explanatory and be like, well, what is that? And we might have to branch out here and there, like a tree a little bit, branch out to figure out what's going on. So we can have a real, comprehensive understanding of no matter what mixing console we're looking at, that we understand what's going on with them. So, that's basically how this series is going to go. And it should be very informative, and I'm hoping by the end of this series that you should have a pretty good understanding of how to break down any mixing console that you run into in a very short period of time and be functionally using it very shortly thereafter. So, you know, that's the process that we're going to go through in this series. Now, just like almost all my other series, is that the whole concept of this, like the last series I did was on microphones, and a whole lot of the concepts that can help you understand how to use the microphone. People get into all kinds of stuff, how to use the console, how to use the, you know, what console's the best, dot, 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 dot. Well, you know, I went through the same thing on microphones, and it can boil down to what Bob's preference is over what Timmy's preference is. And you'd be running around chasing your own tail trying to figure out what your preference is, you know, trying to copy what they're doing because you don't have a good comprehensive understanding of what's happening there. So, to make a long story short, there's some videos that I've put on this channel. One of them is the equal loudness contour, the Fletcher-Munson curves, a simple explanation of phase, recording basics, complex polar waves, noise and distortion. There's another one on here on sound sculpting, harmonics, timbre, harmonic distortion, non-harmonic distortion, timbre of instruments, basic understanding of it. There's also spectral content shaping is a huge one that I want you to watch, because it's very informative into a lot of things that would be happening in that actual console. There is also some saturation ones that I want you to watch that are basically dealing with saturation as far as with distortion and with noise. Dynamic range reduction, using those type of instruments like compressors and expanders. This one's based on a compression type of instruments, using it for compression or coloration. It's a huge topic. Stereo field is another huge one to watch. Signal flow is huge. There's a whole suite of tools on here, audio analysis tools, a bunch of free tools to help you analyze sound and really get it detailed about what you're looking at. And there's also another one here on learning audio engineering that gives you a whole bunch of direction and a bunch more free tools for understanding what's happening with all the concepts we'll be discussing. A pretty large series on acoustics, which basically, if you read about a little bit about acoustics on Wikipedia, you'll have an immediate understanding why I want you to watch that series. Here's a basic music theory series, and that series is really going to help you understand how the music theory, the basic components of it, those components, it's not the basic theory things that we're talking about in that series is just so that you understand most of the concepts that you're going to be dealing with in the studio while you're mixing, and harmonic content and distortions and things like that. There's another one here on analog signals, the basic concepts, and digital signals, which would be a huge thing. Another one series on MIDIs. Synthesizers can be huge. It can be a huge one for you to understand a lot of things happening there. And there's another series here on microphones that can be a lot of help in understanding a whole lot of concepts you might be dealing with when you're dealing with this mixing console. So now I know that sounds like a lot, but the problem is sometimes some people will be looking at a mixing console and they just want you to tell you what it does. Well, that might not be that hard. The problem is you know, it's just like me telling you, you know, you turn some knob on something at NASA and it's going to turn the gas up. Well, you know, or something, you know, but I mean, without a comprehensive understanding of what's happening through that entire space shuttle, then you may not really understand what you're doing. You starting to push knobs all over the place, because why that knob might look real simple, you know, and, you know, prime example is if you go watch that series on spectral content shaping, that I address a huge issue. I'll watch people watching mixing, you know, channels, and Bob will turn up his EQ just a little bit at 1200 hertz. You know, and then I'd be going, and his mix is perfect. And you know, I'll get people go, why doesn't it work like that for mine? Well, because you didn't address the EQ the way you should have, so that at the end of the mix, that's all you had to do. Does that make sense? So that's a huge issue, because they didn't understand all that was probably happening before in the getting the instrument ready, the recording process, the mixing process, and then right before mastering, that all he had to do is turn the EQ up again a little bit right there at those hertz. And that's the way he's seen it. And that might have just been personal preference that you wouldn't have decided to do, or Bob wouldn't have decided to do, or Timmy wouldn't have done, or Jimmy wouldn't have done. So that can be very confusing, because, you know, you tell them that and say, well, we're going to boil down to your ears. And, you know, Jimmy there that showed you how to put the EQ up there a little bit might not have been correct as far as you're concerned. And Bob and Jimmy and Timmy. Does that make sense? And it's almost impossible to teach somebody that except for stating it just like that. So the backwards way of learning it is trying to understand it from the front value. The best way to learn it is to learn that other stuff that I'm pointing out to you. That way, when you get to looking at the mixing console, that all those concepts that it's going to be dealing with, that, you know, it's going to look much simpler to work with. That way that it doesn't look like this big NASA instrument, you know, that, you know, in Star Trek, that it's like, oh, well, I understand all these concepts of sound and what's supposed to be happening, and that knob is going to do that for me. Does that make sense? And it can do this, and it can do that, and it can do that as far as dealing with the concepts of audio, sound, and acoustics. So that might sound like a lot, but, you know, through this series, I think that you're going to get a pretty good understanding of how the console works anyway. But, you know, how you're going to use it and how well you're going to use it is going to depend more on that other content that I'm showing you. Because you can watch videos until you die about how Jimmy or Timmy or Bob think that's how you're supposed to do it. But, you know, without a comprehensive understanding of two things, they've got 50 years of experience that they finally put together, that, you know, that now they understand where they didn't back then while they're fudging around. And you don't going to have 40-year experience. So you know, just like a doctor is going to go to school, you know, to do brain surgery, by the time he gets out, he's pretty much well ready to do brain surgery, but he doesn't have no experience, but he's got the knowledge, you know, to get it done, you know, and he might run into some things that other people might be able to help him through from experience, but probably not as much as if he has that knowledge. He's probably going to be fairly good to go. Does that make sense? In a very short period of time. So that's a really key issue. So that's my direction and where I'm telling you to go. And also in all those videos, I point out tons of free tools for you to analyze all your hardware, software, sound, just about anything you're going to run into. Electronic circuitry, for your signal flow, doing your figuring out all your impulses and your frequency responses and all that kind of stuff for microphones and the consoles, and, you know, finding saturation and distortion, and, you know, how you're going to go through that so you can see what's going on and what's good and bad about that and things like that, so that you have two different things to look at, the actual specs, and you have a bunch of software tools to go back and deal with that, because a whole lot of times you will run into issues, and it's not, you don't need a new console, you don't need a new microphone, you just need to throw an EQ on there, and sometimes it can be that simple. You know, you got to boost the upper end a little bit because it's, you know, like got a high cut filter on it or something, you know, and that's its frequency response, and so you're going to have to adjust for it and see if it captured that content or if it cut it off sharp that you got nothing to work with, and that can be a determining factor, but you can see that from you running a frequency response on the system. And that's a real simple explanation. But in all those videos, that there's a whole bunch of tools like that, and a fairly comprehensive understanding of how to get started with them and start working with them, you know. And basically, I threw the tools out there for the most part and let you dig around on them, because I haven't explained a whole lot of those tools really thoroughly, but most of them are fairly self-explanatory with a little bit of reading. What they're supposed to do, we talked about. So that's how we're going to approach this series. And we're going to approach it one piece at a time. We're going to start right in Wikipedia and just, you know, and look at each individual concept, you know, at one section at a time. And then towards the end, put the larger concept, the smaller concepts together as a more complex system to work with, as far as working within the studio or working within the DAW. So, you know, like I said, go back and watch those videos before you watch the series, and it will be very obvious to you why, because you'll have a much better understanding of why those things are set up the way they are, and why you would want to use them or why you wouldn't want to use them, and things, you know, things like that, determining factors of why you would choose that mixing console over that mixing console for your needs, or if you do that in the DAW, or does that make sense, or where in your production line, in your signal flow of the production, that you would do some of those things, because that can be very pertinent with you understanding more of what's happening with all the subjects that I was pointing out to you. So I hope you enjoy the series. In the next video, we are going to go directly into Wikipedia, and we're going to start right at mixing console, and we're going to go through it, and we're going to branch out into all its different areas so that we can understand the mixing console and the DAW and the hardware. So peace, hope, love, welcome to the series, and I'll see you in the next video.